It's an honor for me to speak to you. I'd like to thank the ITU and the conference organizers for the invitation, but then more importantly for bailing me out of a sticky situation, because about a month ago I realized that I didn't have a visa to get here. And it takes 6 weeks to get a visa from South Africa, which is shorter only than the time it takes to get from South Africa to Edmonton. And it was only thanks to the ITU's lawyer, Patrice, who is also an immigration expert, that I was able to take a few shortcuts and literally get that visa last week, Thursday, the day before I flew. So thank you very much for that. And then, unfortunately, I have to be back in South Africa, so I will be leaving straight after the session, which means I would have spent more time in the air than I have spent in Edmonton, which is a great regret, but I hope that I will be invited back in future by the organizers. So thanks very much for the invitation. I'm sorry I couldn't take more advantage of your hospitality. So the business of talent, let's start by defining one of the fundamental problems, and that's to actually understand what talent is. And I could ask you the question, if there is an athlete, and don't limit yourselves to triathlon if you don't want to. If there is an athlete who personifies talent, who is that person? Who is the single athlete that you've seen, observed, watched, met, worked with, whatever it is, who most personifies the word talent? Think about who that is. So some people, maybe mindful of your location, you're thinking Wayne Gretzky, whose statue is just up the road. Maybe you're thinking Michael Jordan, or Tiger Woods, or Michael Phelps, in which case, if you've selected any of those or similar, your definition and understanding of talent is very much bound up with the definition of ability and performance. That's what it is. On the other hand, perhaps you're thinking of someone, in fact, let's take a step back. One of the people you might think of is Roger Federer. And I've asked this question to a number of audiences, and many people do think Federer is the most talented athlete they've ever seen. No one ever suggests that Rafael Nadal is the most talented athlete they've ever seen, even though performance-wise they're almost inseparable. And if that's the case, it tells you that your definition and understanding of talent has got some component of style, because they look different. And you have a perception that one of them is more natural than the other. So then we have a natural component to talent. Other people identify talent by what is not realized. And I'm sure many of you can think of young athletes who are identified as the next future superstar who never quite made it, and that's what you think of as talent. And you recognize talent by the fact that it's not fulfilled. And the point I'm trying to make with this is that a simple question like what is talent actually causes a fair degree of disagreement. That's not to say that we would disagree on some of the vague general concepts, but there is no specific agreement about what talent is. And the other big problem with talent is that it has a tense problem. And in the session just before lunch, Malcolm alluded to this when he spoke about talent is very difficult to tell apart from training, because when you are the coach, let's say you take the advice of those coaches earlier, and you work with a couple of 14-year-olds and you have them do a 100-meter swimming trial and a 1-kilometer run, what you are assessing is in the present tense performance ability with the intention of predicting something in the future, but what you see today could be the result of something in the past. And so you never know which direction you're facing. And so that's one of the big problems, is we don't have a shared agreement of what talent is defined by, and nor can we agree on the tense with which we assess and then predict talent. And so how can I go forward? How can we progress with a framework and a model for talent idea unless we know which direction you're facing? So for the purposes of overcoming this existential definition problem, I'll talk about talent for now in a business sense as the probability that you will get a return on the investment with that athlete. Let's talk about that as talent for the moment. But then, of course, you have another argument to be made here that talent doesn't exist at all, and we'll get into these two polarized viewpoints around talent. I myself like the idea of a simple framework with which to understand talent, and I'll give you that framework. This is how I would best think about talent ID. Here we are in Edmonton on the 6th of December 2017. The objective in a high-performance world is, in August 2028, at the Olympic Games, which we now know will be in Los Angeles, or perhaps in 2032, assuming we get there, assuming the world makes it that far, given that we've got two infant presidents shooting nuclear toys at one another potentially. Your objective, whether you're Canadian or Scottish or French or Spanish or English or South African, your objective is to put a triathlete on the podium of those Olympic Games. That means that you've got 11 years between today and then, and we know, more or less, give or take a couple of years, that the age of that athlete who wins that medal will be about 26. Jan Frodeno was one day after his 27th birthday. Alistair was 24 and 28 when he won them. As Malcolm said earlier, the women tend to be a little bit older. What that means is we can work backwards and we can say that right now, somewhere in the world, somewhere in your territory, there is a 15-year-old who in 11 years' time will be an Olympic champion. Talent ID is knowing the answer to that question. That's it. That's Talent ID. That's a loaded question. It's not simple. Because from that question come a whole host of other questions. We can ask, does that person look like a future champion? Maybe at 15 they're starting to take the shape, but if we want to go to the 2032 Olympic Games, that person is 11 today, and the answer is almost certainly no, they don't. And so how are we going to identify our Olympic champion in 15 years' time when they don't look like a champion yet? Next question is, do we have the tools? Scientists would like to think that we do, but the reality is that our tools are very imprecise, have very low sensitivity and specificity, so the answer is probably not. And then the third thing is, once identified, or if we have a vague idea of where this person is, what must be done with them for the next 13, 15, however many years? Now, in the most successful sporting systems in the world, this question is the one that's most successfully or correctly answered. So if I think, again, I'm South African, so you'll forgive me for reverting to rugby. New Zealand is our big rugby rival. They understand the answer to that question, and they've developed a coaching intellect across the country that makes sure that it doesn't really matter where that person is. That person is likely to receive very good coaching support for the next 14 or 15 years. I dare say, and forgive me for being presumptuous if this is incorrect, that you have achieved the same thing for those of you who live in Canada when it comes to ice hockey. Germany in football, which is the one you play with your feet, not the version you've taken in North America with the hands, they can also answer these questions better than most. Not precisely. If we knew the answer to these questions, well, if I did, I wouldn't be here. I'd be a billionaire. But we need to be able to answer these questions better. And so Talent ID takes on different purposes depending on the perspective with which you approach the questions. And so there are, as with many things, operational, tactical, and strategic imperatives. The operational imperative for Talent ID, which is the domain of scientists and coaches, is to identify, select, and manage a young athlete into senior level. We can argue and discuss how young, where do we start, what does efficiency mean, what does effectiveness mean, but that's the job of the coach and the scientist within the system. And if you are working on an operational level, as some of you asking questions earlier said you are, that's what you're trying to do. If we step back a little bit, we recognize that there's a tactical purpose to Talent ID, which is to try to take what are almost always limited and scarce resources and direct them towards obtaining maximal returns and to optimize future planning. So that, earlier, you'll remember I spoke about probability of return on investment. That's my paradigm, is a tactical definition of Talent ID. And then there's an even bigger one, which is a strategic one, which is to say that there's only going to be one Olympic gold medal for men and one for women. There's only one World Cup. There's only one world title in different sports. And so from a strategic perspective, countries are using Talent ID, teams are using Talent ID to gain a competitive advantage in a competitive environment. And in this domain, the athlete is a scarce resource. And that's actually really important because, and again, I'm going to flip between different sports, not because I want to relegate triathlon, but just because I don't want to be presumptuous about triathlon and I don't know as much as I should. Teams compete for the same pool of athletes. And so if you understand that, then you can understand why sometimes the best thing to do at this level is not the best thing to do at that level. Because when Barcelona sends talent scouts to Argentina to basically buy up 7- and 8-year-olds, they are operating on a strategic Talent ID level because they know that if they don't do it and a rival does, then they'll end up losing Messi and someone else will have him. Whereas the scientist among us is saying it's absolutely ridiculous that you would try and buy an 8 or a 9-year-old because the probability of accurately predicting who's going to be messy is infinitesimally small. But the opportunity cost for the strategic imperative is too large to ignore it. And so there is tension between these different operational aspects within Talent ID, and you have to understand those to understand why the theoretical concepts around talent identification do not always translate very well into the real world. And so we have to explore a little bit about that. So, tactically, strategically, talent selection, which is to say identifying and then selecting talent, is a budgeting decision because we cannot support, in this instance, 300 athletes within a system. And so what we do is we ask the question, how best do we allocate the resources, assuming that some individuals in this population are more likely to succeed than others, and we then apply a filter, which is 90%, 95%, 99%, take your pick, depends on your resources, and we are left then with a group of people who we call the chosen ones, and it's the chosen ones on whom we spend, not money only, but time, people, opportunities, facilities, and obviously the money that comes with that. And so my definition for Talent ID then is a budgeting decision that allocates who gets the resources, when those resources should be applied or spent, and how they should be applied to specific athletes. Those are the questions around which talent identification and management systems operate. So when we then frame that question, and this is an important concept because and it's a teachable moment, which we'll get onto shortly. If you go, sorry, I'm going to go backwards. If you did not believe in the concept of talent, if you believe that it's about the training and the environment and the culture, and you had no agreement that there is a probability of some people succeeding, then the way that you allocate these limited resources is fundamentally different compared to if you think that there is a subset of the population who might succeed. And the way that you see this played out, unfortunately, and I hate the fact that this debate even exists, is in this polarization of the issue is, are champions born talent or are they made through training? And so this is a concept that has been given to us by popular media and misapplied scientific research. But it's one that I want to address because it has implications for how you then invest in the model that I've just described. And as I said, there's a teachable moment here because what I'm about to explain to you is applicable everywhere. And I say this because I did it myself. I didn't do a PhD in Talent ID. I did a PhD in fatigue, and I did exactly the same thing that I'm about to tell you other people are doing to you in talent, and they do to you in diet, and they did to you when it came to asking whether you should run barefoot or in shoes, and they will do it to you when it comes to asking whether it's strength or endurance. And the 5 steps of bullshittery, sorry for you can bleep that out of the video, my bad, is number 1, you pick a complex issue. Elite sporting performance is a complex issue. There are so many strings to pull and interconnected webs and joints and levers and so forth that it's enormously complex. But what you have to then do is you polarize it and you say it's all about this versus this. Diet. It's all about carbohydrates versus fats. Fatigue, in my instance, it's all in the brain, it's all in the muscle. And these are foolish steps to take, but this is what you do. You polarize it, and then step number 3 is you tell people what they believe. In other words, you give them their A, and say, you believe that fatigue is all in the muscle. And then step 4 is, I'm about to tell you that you're wrong. And I'm going to reveal to you a revolutionary new answer, which is B, and then I cherry pick examples of B. So Talent ID. You believe that all elite athletes are the result of talent and genetics. I'm about to reveal to you there's a revolutionary new method called training, and it explains it, and I'm going to give you selected examples of it. That's how this works. And your job as experts and leaders in this field is to resist these steps. And again, I say this only because I went through it. In my PhD, did the same things. And it took me to almost the end of my PhD before I recognized what we were doing. And we did a disservice to the field because we polarized something unnecessarily and unfairly, and the truth lay somewhere in the complex interplay between those different things. And I don't want you to take my word for it, not on my PhD, but I want you to watch a clip which does it's textbook example of these 5 steps. And I'm even going to show you what you're looking out for. Listen to words like we've believed, it's all about, any validity, completely different, what we've all had, and it's not what the science is saying. That's the kind of language that comes from people who are selling you this extremism way to interpret science. And I'm going to ask the gents, there's a video clip. It's a few minutes long, and then after that I'm going to talk you through exactly how it happens and how it pertains to talent ID.
For centuries, we've believed that being a success, being a champion, is about talent and about genetics. I became British table tennis #1 for the first time in January 1995, and that was a big shock for the sporting community in the UK. I was still very young, and not many people expected me to get to the top that soon. So I was suddenly on the receiving end of these huge eulogies about a very specific genetic inheritance, about having oodles of talent. But I'm not sure that this narrative, which typically defines the way we describe success, has any validity. I think that success has something to do with something completely different. I grew up on Silverdale Road in suburban Reading, a pretty nondescript street, except for one thing. It had tons of great table tennis players, me and my brother. Karen Wick, Commonwealth champion, Andy Wellman, one of the top players in the UK, Paul Trott, Keith Hodder. It was unbelievable. In fact, that tiny, tiny locale produced more great table tennis players in the 1980s than the rest of the nation combined. If you think that it's all about genetics, why would it be that just that one specific street was affected? Consider this too. Spartak Moscow, an impoverished tennis club on the outskirts of Russia's capital, produced more top 20 players on the female side of the tennis game than the whole of the United States combined. Once again, our inclination to think of success in terms of genetics has to be flawed. When you dig down into the lives of all great performers, whether it's David Beckham in football, Serena Williams, Roger Federer, myself in table tennis, or Picasso in the arts, what we have all had, the thing we have shared, is very specific, often unique opportunities to clock up lots of practice. In my case, that was brought about because Pete Charter's coach on Silverdale Road, he was the best table tennis coach in the country. He provided access to the only 24-hour table tennis club in the south of England. Now you're going to say that you need both opportunity on the one hand and talent on the other, but that is not what the science is saying. The reason I say that genes are not that important is because over time, through practice, we utterly transform the people we are. It's like when we're practicing, we're downloading very specialized software that enables us to engage more successfully in whatever area we're practicing within. And you can actually see this in brain scanning. Certain areas of the brain get bigger. We develop new neural connections. Myelin, an insulating material, makes the signals traveling through the brain that much faster. And ultimately, when you look at the science, rather than our own implicit biases, you arrive at the conclusion that champions are not born, they're made.
So that's a 5-minute journey through those exact 5 steps, because the very first thing he says is, for centuries we've believed that being a champion is about genetics and inherited I forget exactly the words. So by show of hands, who of you in this room are coaches? I hope you appreciate that if you do believe that being a champion is about inheritance and genetics, you just made yourself completely redundant. Because as a coach, your existence depends on the fact that you can improve an athlete's performance, and it's not about genetics. And so the very first starting point is to polarize this issue of talent versus training into two extremes. And so when he says we've believed, the correct response, as I said, this teachable moment, is we haven't. Don't tell me what I believe, I'll decide for myself. When he says it's all about, the word should be partly. Why polarize things? When he says it's got any validity, some, completely different, in addition to what we've all had, among other things. And it's not what the science is saying. That's your science, Matthew. I'll look for myself. And I'll show you some of the science that disputes some of the things that he said there. But the point I want to make, and Alex alluded to this, I think it was your third maxim, was change your mind but slowly. This is asking you to change your mind in a transformational, radical way. Like as if science is a wrecking ball with Miley Cyrus swinging on it from one side of the world to the next and saying, you used to think it was all about genetics, and now we're going to tell you that it's all about training. And of course the answer is going to lie somewhere in the middle. And so this is the kind of thinking that you really have to be very disciplined and attuned to in order to reject. Now that's not to say that this concept of practice and improving yourself through work is all bad. It's not. In fact, there are very positive aspects to it. But if you apply it in the way that he's asking you to, specifically at the end by saying, you're going to tell me that you need both opportunity on the one hand and genetics on the other, but that's not what the science is saying. He's asking you to reject half the picture. He's telling you that this is only a rabbit. Can everyone see that it's a rabbit and a duck? I hope you can. If you can't, ask someone next to you. Can everyone see that this is a young woman and an old woman? It's a bit trickier than the rabbit and the duck, but most people can see it. Now the key point, I'm just using these basic issues to illustrate a concept to you, is that there is nothing in that picture, or that one, that needs to change for it to actually be both those things. The only thing that is required is A, that you are open-minded enough to see that perhaps you're missing half the picture, and B, your perspective has to change so that what used to be someone's chin now becomes someone's nose. That's it. Nothing in the picture has to change. So when we apply the same thinking to complex issues, is sporting success talent or training, and you are insistent that it's only one or the other, and it can't possibly be both, and that's not what the science is saying, then you are deliberately choosing to, at best, be only 50% correct. So let's reject polarized thinking, and that applies not only to this talent versus training debate, it applies to diet, it applies to fatigue, it applies to training modalities, everything you can think of. These polarized arguments are very rarely constructive. Think politics, and you understand the point, right? So this is, in the talent idea, that's teachable moment done now. Let's get back to the talent versus training question. This is the rabbit and the duck. So on the left-hand side is a model which basically holds that performance level is constrained by some innate factor that training time or time spent in practice and the amount and the quality of practice improves an athlete from their starting point, but that we have a ceiling beyond which training does not work. Now, when you read books, and there have been a number of them, Syed, who you've just seen a clip about, wrote one of them, Daniel Coyle, Malcolm Gladwell, Rasmus Ankerson, I think could be the name, it's escaped me for the moment, sorry. They've all written books, and one of the things they quote to argue this model is they talk about a guy by the name of Francis Galton, who's a very interesting character in history. He was Charles Darwin's cousin. And so he would have been one of the first recipients of the whole survival of the fittest model and would become known as the father of eugenics, which has a very dodgy, sordid history and past, which you would be fascinated perhaps to read, but this is not a lecture on eugenics. But what Galton said in 1869, based on some of the stuff that he would have discussed with cousin Charles, perhaps at family lunches, was that if this be the case, because remember back then, they didn't understand genetics. They didn't have DNA. They hadn't recognized, that would be almost 100 years later. But what they did understand was inheritance. And they knew that tall people had tall children and short parents would have short kids. And so Galton put 2 and 2 together and came up with 22, when he basically said that if this is the case with stature, this being that it's inherited, then it will be true too as regards every other physical feature, circumference of the head, size of the brain, weight of gray matter, number of brain fibers, and thence a step on which no physiologist will hesitate, mental capacity. So that's 1869. In 2017 English, he's basically saying that if height is inherited, then so must intelligence be inherited. Now, that is a step on which most people would now hesitate, but we have got the benefit of 150 odd extra years in Wikipedia. And but this quote is something that you will read in books in support of the whole, we believe it's genetic. I just want to make the point that in 1869, they didn't have sporting competitions. There was no such thing at that stage. And so Galton might not have thought about this at all if he was applying his model to sport. And so it's been borrowed and applied very badly out of context. But nevertheless, that's the model. And when you read the populist books, not the scientists, what you discover is that there are genetic or innate factors that determine the level of performance that is reached. So training is not irrelevant, but there is a ceiling beyond which we cannot progress because of these innate or genetic factors. So that's the rabbit, this is the duck. The duck model, which is what Syed argued in that video, and there's a number of books, is that performance and the attainment of expert performance is a function of training. Time spent training, interestingly, not even quality. That's been added on later. And a psychologist from the States called Anders Ericsson has written that the distinctive characteristics of exceptional performers are the result of adaptations to extended and intense practice that selectively activate dormant genes that are contained within all healthy individuals' DNA. So he's a psychologist. Geneticists cringe at this concept of dormant genes because there's actually no such thing. But nevertheless, the point that he's making is, I think, quite clear, namely that time spent in what Ericsson defines as deliberate practice, and that's got a very specific definition, determines performance without there being a ceiling. So his argument basically is that practice is sufficient. Now, the origins of that argument, and again, it's oversimplification a little bit for the sake of the presentation, come from a study that Ericsson did in 1993, where he goes along to the School of Music in Berlin, and he asks all these aspirant violinists to please think backwards, so this is retrospective, about how much time they spent practicing the violin from the time that they started to play it. And then what he does is he has the teachers at the School of Music grade those students into categories. And so they are either the best experts in orange, those who are merely good in light blue, and the least accomplished in blue, dark blue. And then he's got a control group made up of professional violinists in green and amateur piano players in purple. And what he discovered is that there is a very clear separation by the time they go and study the musical instrument in Berlin, such that the best experts have accumulated just on about 10,000 hours of practice compared to the good experts at 8,000 and the least accomplished who are at about 5,000. Now, to his credit, Ericsson didn't call it the 10,000 hour rule, but I guess for someone it was too good to be true. And so this becomes known as the 10,000 hour concept, that it would take you 10,000 hours of deliberate practice in order to achieve mastery. And so Ericsson, in a subsequent paper describing his work in 2009, writes that the development of expert performance is primarily constrained by engagement in deliberate practice and the quality of the available training resources. Now, there's a number of very important things missing from this 1993 study. Number one is the quality of the training has not been assessed. But you can appreciate that's very difficult to do. How do you, at the age of 20, think back to the quality of the practice you did when you were 12? That's difficult enough to even think back to 1 or 2 weeks ago's quality. This is very difficult to do. So it's retrospective, we can't answer that. But for me, there are two really interesting things in this graph. Number one is, I think this is the most significant point in the whole figure. Ericsson's obviously focused on the end point, where they've achieved their 10,000 hours or their 8 or their 5. But if you look at this, bearing in mind that it's retrospective, by the age of 10, there is already a separation in training time between those people who are going to be the best in orange and those people who are going to be the least accomplished in light blue. And so by the age of 10, the best players have already done 1,000 hours and the least accomplished have only done 500. So what is it that at the age of 10 has already triggered that difference in training time? Is it pushy parents? Maybe. We don't know because it's retrospective. Could it be and we heard Professor Cote speak this morning about it, could it be that there are factors related to how the child engages with the instrument that actually drives their desire to play more? In other words, we might have the causality completely backwards, because we assume that the practice drives the ability, when in actual fact at the age of 10 it could be the other way around, especially with parents and a child trying to play the violin badly. And maybe mom says, listen, here's a bat and a ball, why don't you go play outside? And so that's somewhat facetious, but the point I'm trying to make is it's not impossible that there is already a difference in ability which then drives the person to actually practice more. And I'm fascinated by why that separation exists as early as it does. So that's an unanswered question. We don't know, because these studies are almost always by nature retrospective. The other big thing that's missing, it's the same thing when Alex showed you a graph this morning, it's the same thing, is Ericsson shows you no measures of range in this figure. In fact, if you go back to the 93 paper, you'll see that that's the case. No standard deviations, no standard errors, no confidence intervals, no maximums, no minimums, no ranges, nothing. That's all you got. And that's really important, because if this person existed, this is a least accomplished person who's done 10,000 hours, he would prove that volume is not enough. And if this person existed, namely an expert who's only done 5,000 hours and he's classified as one of the best, he would prove that something else matters too. Maybe quality, maybe something innate. And we didn't get that picture from Ericsson. And so we were presented, and remember those 5 steps, this was the 5th one. I'm going to show you B. I'm only going to show you that aspect of B which supports my position. And so there is missing information without which we cannot make a judgment call. And the problem with this, and the reason it's worth arguing against, is because it leads us down a path of actually driving what turn out to be some undesirable actions and behaviors. So you all know who this is, and you all know where this story ends. Well, okay, that's not where it ended. But Tiger made his 75th comeback since 2012 the other day, and it actually went well. So maybe in 2018 he will feature again. I hope so. But you know, you saw the story. Maybe some of you remember seeing this kid on the Bob Hope show putting as a 4-year-old and thinking, what a remarkable young talent. And sure enough, he delivered on it. So did she. I remember actually picking up Sports Illustrated when I was not even a teenager, and there was Serena Williams and her sister Venus, and of course she's gone on to be the most decorated player. But the problem is that it's very easy for us to think of these individuals as the norm, when in actual fact they are the unicorns. And again, Tiger in fact is, in terms of injury and the breakdown and so forth, there's a lot of research now showing that early specialization predicts injury risk and so forth. So in some respects he is the norm. But in terms of success, there is a real aspect of confirmation or survivorship bias in these stories, because we don't see the 999 people who, like Tiger Woods, played golf at 4, or like Serena, played tennis at 6 or 7 and didn't succeed. And so the perception is built that this is the path to the top, when in actual fact this is the unusual, exceptional path to the top that doesn't happen for most people and may in fact be undesirable. And so like with many things, the answer will lie in the stuff that you don't see, because when we look at these problems, and this is true in science again, is we are looking up at the moon, and we must appreciate that we are only ever seeing one side of it. And you have to work exceptionally hard to get round to the other side of it. It takes a lot of effort to go to the dark side of the moon. And again, that's your responsibility as people who are leaders in your various fields. You carry with you the responsibility of working hard to get to the backside of the moon. And if you got there, this is what you would discover. So this is a study on chess players where the researchers, much like Ericsson asked on violinists, he says, how long does it take in chess to become a master-level chess player? And the answer is 11,000 hours. So that's cool, because it sort of supports the same amount of time that it takes to become a world-class violinist. Plus or minus 5,500 hours. So now we actually do have a standard deviation. So we've got some indication of the range. That's not very reassuring, those of you who don't know anything about stats. When the average is only just double what the standard deviation is, you know that the data looks like this. And so within that cohort of chess players, there are people who became masters within 3,000 hours, and there is one guy who deserves a Lifetime Achievement Award Well, in fact, it's not even in its lifetime trying award, because he's been doing it for 25,000 hours and he still isn't there. So what you've got is an 8-fold difference in the amount of time that it takes to reach a given level in an activity, which is not constrained by physical attributes like triathlon is constrained. Now, and I'm not being disparaging towards chess, but I hope that you can appreciate that there are big differences, and we'll get to those shortly, between these two activities. And so this is how you should present data when you're arguing for what it takes to become successful. So now, just focus on the black columns. This is the percentage of players in the master group who needed a certain amount of training hours. Sorry, my laser pointer's on its way out. And what you discover is that 1 in 4 need more than 10,000 hours, and 1 in 8 need fewer than 5,000 hours. So now, remember, I defined, I defined talent ID from a business perspective, in the sense that it's a budgeting decision. And if you come back to that, then this predisposition matters, because you can produce that 3,000 hour guy, we can get 8 of him for the same cost of one 25,000 hour guy. So predisposition matters if you think about talent ID from a business perspective. What about sport? This is a study out of Australia, and there are so many of these, and I think Jean earlier presented to you a much better argument than I can. The average time is considerably less than 10,000, and Malcolm alluded to this, is that a number of elite athletes achieve success very quickly as long as they've got a diverse sporting background behind them. And so the engagement and the sampling and the diversification is a shortcut to quicker progression to the very top once they make that selection. And so that should be where we start to drive our behaviors. And so that brings us on to this argument about genetics and whether there is some predisposition and can we assess it. So just very quickly, I'm not here to give you a genetics lesson, but genetically we are, they tell me, 99.9% similar and 0.1% different. But that 0.1% different makes a significant difference to what's called our phenotype, which is to say physical appearance and attributes. And in the world of genetics and performance, we talk specifically about what are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, in the sense that you and I could have the same gene, but we have different variants of that gene. And that's what gives us different characteristics. And so it's very much the same thing as changing the meaning with a single letter. So for example, he shut the door, as opposed to he shot the door. There are other vowels you could include in there, but I couldn't find pictures of it, so I didn't. But the point is that in the same way that a sentence's meaning can change depending on the letter, so does the function of an Achilles tendon, mitochondria, cardiovascular systems, and so forth. And so that's where a lot of the investment into finding these genetic predictors of performance has gone. But it's actually enormously complex. And so if we take the example of height, there's Michael Phelps and his coach, Bob Bowman. And the only reason I show this is if there's one book you do read on this stuff, it's called The Sports Gene by David Epstein, which I haven't yet read Alex's, but for now, The Sports Gene stands alone as the best book written on sports science ever. Maybe February 2018 it'll be displaced. And the point that David makes is actually that even within height, you can see that these two men have the same length legs, but Phelps has got a considerably longer upper body, and that's a body designed to swim. Hisham Al-Garouj, who's the world record holder in the mile, and Michael Phelps wear the same length pants, but they're 18 centimeters difference in height. And so one of them has got long legs and a short body, and the other one's got a long body and short legs, and that's why they do excel in their specific disciplines. And then, of course, you get other extremes. So that's Manute Bol and Bugsy, someone or other, I was going to say Malone, but I've forgotten now. Mogs or something. My memory for names is poor. And you get these vast differences in height. And we know from twin studies and a number of different research studies that most of height, 80% of height, can be explained through genetics. It's inherited. 20% is environmental. And so even when we know a relatively simple one-dimensional concept or construct like height, it takes 294,831 SNPs, genetic variants, to account for 45% of that genetic variance. So that's how complex these things are, is there are so many different possible polymorphisms that explain something as simple as that. How much more complex then might human physiological performance be? And so when companies come along and they say, we can predict whether you're going to be an endurance athlete or a power athlete, they're not guessing blindly, but they don't have anything like the resolution that would be needed to prescribe and change course based on that information. So that's important to understand. Now, what about trainability? So this was a study on 470 previously untrained individuals, and they undergo, I think it was 2 months worth of training. This was the Bouchard et al. Study. And what you find, and those of you who coach, you will recognize this immediately, is that some people respond very badly. And on the right-hand side are people who we'd call the high responders. And so this is measured by change in VO2 max over the course of the 2 months. And so there are some people who want their money back on the left, and there are other people who are very happy because they've increased by basically a liter per minute. And when you break that down, you discover so 1% of them are the extremely high responders and 1 in 14 are the low responders. Those changes, your position on that spectrum has been linked to these genetic polymorphisms. So the average increase in VO2 max is 17%. There are some people who improve by less than 4%, and there are some people who improve by 40%, and there is a panel of these single nucleotide polymorphisms that predicts it. Now, is trainability a component of talent? Must be, surely. Arguably, the ability of a person to respond to training is a talent ID predictor. So that is evidence that there are genetic factors that influence talent. So one application of this, just out of interest, and this is one area that I'm particularly fascinated in, is the East African running phenomenon. So this shows how many this is the distance running medals that have been won since 1988 by different continents. And so in the Australia, New Zealand region, there are 3 medals, 5 to South America, 8 to Asia, 11 to North America, 31 to Europe, 129 to Africa, excluding Kenya, and 135 Kenyan medal winners since 1988. And what's most interesting about that is that within the Kenyan population, the probability is that you come from one tribe. 80% of them are Kalenjin. And of the Kalenjin, 80% of those, and it's even higher, by the way, for marathon running, when you look at top 20 times, is from the sub-tribe called the Nandi. And so scientists have, for the last few decades, been very curious about what is it about the Nandi sub-tribe specifically, or the Kenyans, if you want to be more general, that predisposes them to this remarkable dominance of distance running events. And so they look for the gene, and they can't find it. And I've read papers concluding that therefore there can't be a gene. And I just want to show you again, if we thought height was complicated, what makes, I should put Kipchoge's picture up here now, not Martin Lowell's. What makes Martin Lowell or Kipchoge the runner that they are? Obviously, VO2 max, economy threshold, molecular efficiency, oxidative enzyme capacity, early life factors, biomechanics, brain oxygenation is something that we've studied on elite Kenyans recently, body type, total hemoglobin and blood volume, and pulmonary gas exchange. Those are just some of the predictors or some of the factors that have been put forward to try and explain this dominance. Now, the ones that are easiest to measure are up here on the top left, but it's been very difficult to link any of these performance attributes to genetic factors. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a fundamental challenge when you as a researcher go in to do what is called a CaseControl Study to look for genes that affect performance. Because the way it works is that you have to go in and identify people who are cases, and in this instance, the case is a person who has the characteristic we are interested in, so an elite runner. So we're going to go in there, imagine you and I are partnering up to do a study looking for the performance gene in Kenyan distance runners. A case is an elite runner, and a control is a person who is identical in every respect except for the characteristic of interest. In other words, they are exactly the same except they're not an elite runner. So it's going to have to be another Kenyan, age and gender matched, similar socioeconomic status, school backgrounds, etc., but they can't be an elite runner. So I'll give you some funny examples of how I think this plays out. In 2014, a guy by the name of Dixon Chamba wins the Tokyo Marathon. So that's one of the majors. So I'm sure no one would disagree that if we were doing our study in Kenya, this man would be a case. And we would take his DNA and we'd say, let's look at Dixon Chamba and let's compare him to a guy who's a control subject. Another case would have been Martin Lowell, who in 2008 was the world's best marathon runner. The story, however, is that 5 years ago, Dixon Chamba was working as a gardener for Martin Lowell. He wasn't a runner. And so can you imagine the situation where you and I go in there, and we say, we're going to get Martin Lull's DNA as a case, and now we need a control. Who should we get? Why don't we test the gardener? He's not a runner. 5 years later, Dixon Chumba decides maybe that he fancies having his own garden, and he's a Tokyo Marathon champion. And so when we compare cases and controls in Kenya, they look identical, and we conclude that there's no gene. That might be because they all have it. And no one knows that, because there's a fundamental problem in how you design the study. There are other examples of that. Paul Tergat, one of the great runners in history, didn't run at school, became elite within 2 years. He would have been a control had you sampled him in, let's say, 1991. By 1993, he's a case. The current world record holder, his own words, before 2010, I was concentrating on farming and had never run before. Now, the one bit of fine print here is that the lifestyle in Kenya means that very few people are coming off the couch to become elite athletes. In fact, no one is. They don't have the couch. So, and I think Malcolm actually spoke of this earlier, is in the case of the Brownlees, he inherited in them a foundation that had been set by lifestyle, and that's arguably the case for these Kenyan athletes as well. So that's certainly true. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's very difficult to find a gene, and we will not find a gene because we are limited so severely by our capacity to find the right controls. And so the entire premise is flawed. Another interesting example, this is an eye chart. I don't know whether anyone can read the line below the red. If you can, from 20 feet away, it means you've got 20/20 vision. So the way this works is if you're up here, it means that you can read from 20 feet what a normal person can read from 200 feet, and you'd be better off with radar. If you're here, it means that you can read from 20 feet what a normal person can read from 50, and then you need a fairly strong set of spectacles. And so the average vision is 20/20. That means that you can read from 20 what the average person can from 20 feet. And again, this is in David Epstein's excellent book, is that in professional basketball, 81% of players have got 20/15 vision, which means they can read from 20 feet what the average person can only read from 15. And in softball players at the Olympic level, half the team has got 20/11 vision. And so in actual fact, the typical eye tests were maxed out by elite athletes. And so it might be that a prerequisite to become a professional athlete in which eye-hand coordination is required is vision that is better than average. And that's genetic. That's genetic. And so what we're left with is basically a set of things, and this is just some for which there's data. And I published a paper with a guy called Malcolm Collins, who's a geneticist, so if there are any genetic errors, please blame him. But sex is the most powerful genetic predictor of performance. That's why we have a category for men and women. We have that category because we want to protect the integrity of competition for people who do not have a Y chromosome. And that's not chauvinistic to say that, that's physiological reality. That's why the Caster Semenya issue is so difficult to deal with. Anyway, this is not a talk on that. Height, we know, 80% inherited. We've only managed to explain 45% of. VO2 max, we know there's an inherited and an environmental component. So too with trainability, muscle fiber type. No one really knows where to put that line. What about all these things? Body shape, the nilotic build of the Kenyans with their long skinny legs and narrow hips. Vision I've shown you, skill, psychology, susceptibility to injury. If you want to be an elite triathlete, you cannot be on the low end of injury predisposition because you will not handle the 30 hours a week of training that you've heard is done by the Olympic champion. Whether you're a morning or evening type, something as simple as that. We've got data in South Africa showing that elite team sport athletes are significantly more likely to be evening types, whereas elite endurance athletes are morning types, because that's just the way the world pulls you. So anyway, there's a load of these different things that make a difference. And the point I want to make is that if you understand that talent drives a budgeting decision, then you understand that your limited resources have to be allocated effectively, and therefore it's incumbent on you that you have to be able to identify who is the most viable athlete from this population to succeed, and then you invest in them. Now that's difficult to do, because as much as I've spoken about 45% predictability there and the 49% here and so forth, as I said up front, the tools with which we can filter and separate out the likely, the chosen ones, and the less likely to succeed are so imperfect that it actually causes more problems perhaps than it's worth. But practically we have to do it, because otherwise we're going to spend our $1 million on everyone. And that means each person gets 10 cents. As opposed to saying $1 million on 10 people, now we can start to look at making them effective. So that's the challenge that those of you who are in a high performance situation find yourselves, is you have to at some point sacrifice what is correct in order to be prudent. So that's difficult. Doing the best thing is not always the right thing. So hopefully this explains what are called these sporting gold mines. You know, in rugby, New Zealand, distance running, football, Brazil, nowadays Germany, ice hockey, where we are right now, the Picasso of table tennis up in England. And the point I'm trying to make is that each of these gold mines is thank you. Someone is paying attention. Each of these gold mines exist for different reasons. Now, arguably, there are some sports for which the physiological predisposition matters more than others because there are more ways to win. So, for example, football, again, soccer. Let's go soccer. You can have very different physiological characteristics and you can succeed because there are different ways to do so. Whereas if you're Usain Bolt and your job is running in a straight line for 100 meters or around a bend for 200, there is a much narrower set, perhaps, of requirements. That's why the NFL draft is so imprecise for quarterbacks, because you can be a great quarterback in 6 different ways. You can be a great 100-meter sprinter in one way. And so the weighting which we assign to these different inherited physiological characteristics varies, but the reality is that they are there. And we have to respect them in order to make the prudent decisions. Now, why then is it so difficult? This is a photograph where I'm from in Cape Town of a school match at the coin toss of a rugby match. And this man in the middle is the adult referee. And the two players either side of him are the captains of the school under 13 teams. And so this is the Rondebosch Boys, this is my old hunting ground where I still occasionally take myself for a run, and this is Paul Boys. So this is an Afrikaans guy on the right and English, and those of you know, there's a difference between these two guys. Now, the thing is, if I said to you that you had to choose one athlete to back as a future rugby player, which of those two do you pick? Because the problem is, the pot of gold, which again, it's not money, it's people, time, facilities, competition, is not infinite. And so the decision is challenging because we have limited resources. The selection is almost always a zero-sum game because the selection of one means the exclusion of the other. If we could change that, and you've got to think about ways, can you change the zero-sum game aspect of high-performance systems, then that would be a really good step to take. And then thirdly, we've got such imprecise tools. And the main thing that drives bad selection is the incentive of the person making the pick. Because if I'm coaching at under 13 level, I'm backing this guy every day of the week. Because we know in rugby, and again, forgive me for talking rugby, but it's the sport I know most. That's the guy who's got the attributes that make a good rugby player. Whereas if I'm picking for the purposes of 20-year-old, then it's a much more difficult decision because this guy here in the blue and white stripes, that could be as big as he ever gets. Whereas the little guy might surpass him, and by virtue of the fact that he's had to survive for 5 years against big guys, he might be the toughest, most nuggety, skillful, evasive little guy you've ever come across in your life. And one day he'll be the toughest, most nuggety, skillful big guy you've ever come across in your life. And so the perspective of the person making the selection drives the pick. Now, the problem is, and this is true in South Africa, is that people are incentivized in the short term, and so we pick there. And the result is that we neglect that because of the zero-sum nature of this particular game. So again, whose shares do you buy? It's the same concept as buying shares in a company. And so what we've done is we've created this race to the bottom because of present incentives, which are top-down. So in other words, if I'm coaching 13-year-olds, I'm picking big 13-year-olds, and there's no long-term planning or strategy goes into that. And as I say, it's driven by opportunity, cost, competitions, and fear. Now, my opinion, and I think this is where it's relevant for triathlon, because there are very few countries in the world where triathlon gets first pick of the best athletes. In fact, I doubt that there are any. My opinion is that there's too much inertia to change that system. I've tried in South Africa, well, not me, but people have tried in South Africa to move away from this preoccupation with picking young, big guys. And let's actually invest in a 5-year plan of selection. It's not going to work because there's too much value in that. It's crazy, but that's how it is. And so I think there's too much inertia to change it. And so the best thing you can then do is you've got to figure out, are there ways that I can turn the inefficiencies into opportunities? The inefficiency of one system might well become the opportunity for me in my system. And so how might that work? Right, so first of all, there are a couple of risks when you come to talent ID and selection. Firstly, there's an inclusion error, and that means that you identify and select the wrong person. In other words, I pick that big guy because he's big. But in 5 years' time, he's still big, and he's not skillful, and he's slow. And I made a mistake selecting him. The second one is that you fail to identify the right people, and those two are opposite sides of the same coin because of this zero-sum game. So I pick the big guy, and I don't pick the small guy, and as a consequence, I end up making two mistakes with one decision. The third one is that I identify and select too infrequently, or only once, and so we'll call that the insufficiency error. And then the final one is that we provide the wrong environment for both the included and the excluded. And the excluded is the most important person. The guy that we didn't pick. The key thing, in my opinion, that determines a successful sports system is what do you do with the person that you didn't select? Do you, especially young, do you still give that person the opportunity? Given how imprecise your selection is, do you still give him the opportunity? So the first two are talent ID issues, and the second two are talent development issues. So just to show you where these things play out with minimum risk, maximum risk, minimum reward. This was a study done out of Denmark or Scandinavian countries. Same approach as the violence study, where they asked elite athletes at the age of 21 what they'd done when they were younger. And they divide them into two groups, the elite, top 10 in the world, top 3 in Europe. And this is what they find. Training time per week on the y-axis as a function of age bands on the x. This is what happens with near elites. And so there are 3 distinct phases. When they are pre-adolescents, elite athletes trained less than those who would go on to become near elite. And then there's an adolescent watershed, which happens at around the age of 15 or 16. And it's at that point that those athletes who become near elite actually drop off their training time in their main sport, and those who go on to become elite continue to increase. And then finally, there's the continued decline into adulthood. Now, there's a whole lecture, and I'm not even close to being the best person qualified to discuss this. Some of the other speakers you've heard from are, so I'll ask them in the break. But the point that I'm trying to make is that this whole early specialization thing that we drive, and when we select, all those errors, inclusion error, exclusion error, insufficiency error, if we select too young, that's what we run the risk of doing. And so this model is telling us that what we should be doing is we should be delaying the selection and the specialization into elite teams until at least adolescence. Because that's when you can finally, or for the first time rather, tell where those physiological chips are going to fall. So that's particularly important. So let's look at a real example. So in South Africa, we've got this under-13 rugby tournament, which, as I say, is ridiculous and mad, but it's not going anywhere. We're stuck with it. Where basically every single province selects its best under-13-year players. And so we've got some data that was done in a study. It starts in 2005. And the question is, what proportion of the best 13-year-olds in 2005 are still in the system 5 years later at the age of 18? And the answer is 1 in 4. And so there's a 76% dropout rate between 2005 and 2010 when they turn 18. So that's 265 of those players are gone from the system. They've obviously been replaced somewhere else because we still need 349. What's most interesting is that we also have a 16-year-old competition in South Africa. So we kind of have a midpoint. And what that shows us is that most of the drop-off happens by the age of 16. So 239 of the 265 disappear from 13 to 16, and then the other 26 disappear from 16 to 18. So what does that tell you? That's obvious. It should be predictable, because you know that in a sport in which physical capabilities is so important, the key point in the development is adolescence. And so any selection you make before adolescence is bound to be inefficient and inaccurate. And so that's just hemorrhaging money by investing at 13. And I wish they'd get rid of that tournament, but as I say, they're not going to. However, what it does give us is an opportunity to capitalize for other sports. And so this is the same model. We start with 100. We cut them down by 70% in the first step. That's to 13 to 16. We zap out all those people who are filtered out for whatever reason. Maybe they weren't quite good enough. Maybe there were other issues. Maybe there was no reason other than a bad coach. Who knows? Next step, we got down to 20. So now we've lost 80 out of our initial 100. We're adding in the fashionably lates and the early arrivals. And eventually, by adulthood, we're left with 4 out of the starting 100. So that's a 4% system. And what's characteristic of a 4% system is that 96% of them are ghosts. And those ghosts are really important because those ghosts could be the result of errors where you've provided either an inclusion error or the wrong environment, which is to say they are probably still highly athletic individuals who, for whatever reason, haven't succeeded in that pipeline. But can they succeed in yours? And it should not escape your attention that in triathlon there are 3 independent pathways in addition to the triathlon one. There's a swimming one, there's a cycling one, and there's a running one, and there's a triathlon one. So you can imagine how many ghosts there are produced by the other 3 who you could capitalize on if you were clever enough to do so. And so this population of ghosts is the most valuable asset to a sport because there are people who displayed some athletic ability very young, and then they are lost to the system. Now, they might be lost to the system because they just didn't have the athletic ability. Fine. You discard them. Hopefully they find other sports or they continue to do the sport, but not at the elite level. But if they possess the athletic ability that you, as a good coach, applying all the stuff you've learned this morning, you can turn those ghosts into your most valuable resource. And that's the key question. So I'm going to skip through this next slide very quickly because it's a summary of what I've presented and you don't need to hear it even more. And basically challenge you then. Can you select smarter? We don't know. Science at this point is not good enough to select smarter. Can we delay selection? The answer is you probably don't want to delay the selection because you need people to be exposed, and that requires some form of selection. What you can do is you can change the nature of selection so that you're not putting them into an elite pathway too young, because that closes off other opportunities. Can we delay specialization? Yes. And we should be looking to do that. We should be looking to actively drive diversification as opposed to specialization. Can we change the nature of competition to minimize the impact of biological differences? I think that we should try to do that. It doesn't escape my attention to think and realize that competition makes up such a small percentage of a triathlete's total exposure to the sport, yet we put so much focus on that thing. It's like that 80-20 principle, but it's a 99-1. Competition is a tiny proportion of what a young athlete does, and yet it becomes the thing around which we base all our decisions. That's foolish. So we need to be able to change that. And then finally, can we restructure how the coach-athlete interaction works? And again, it's because of that small competition. So I know that I haven't gone into massive detail on triathlon. I hope that you'll forgive me for doing that on purpose, because I don't want to be presumptuous and force-feed you with what are basically ignorant statements. But the key point, the end game for you, regardless of whether you're operational, tactical, or strategic, is your intention be to expose everyone. And again, the beauty of your sport is that you can expose them to 3 different branches and 1, and you can still get them to the same point within an acceptable inefficiency. And then the key point is you have to figure out how do you keep those athletes viable for as long as possible. What does viable mean? That's up to you. I'm not going to tell you that. And on that note, I'm going to say thanks again to the ITU. And the other thing I must say is that in this audience, and the very next speaker, in fact, is one of the 2 people who examined my PhD, which was not on this subject at all. And the other one is sitting at the back, and I'll speak to you tomorrow, Stephen Chung. So despite the fact that I polarized fatigue into muscle versus brain and made the same mistakes that I've accused others of making, I'd like to thank those 2 gents for not holding it against me. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Ross. That was beyond brilliant. I know we're a wee bit over time, so I'm going to take away my privilege of making a question, although I'm thinking the question is, where do your athletes come from? I'm hoping everybody is kind of humming with that question. So is it okay to have a couple of questions from the group? So if people have questions for Ross, we've got time for 2. So if you scamper up to the mic, it's first come, first serve.
Ross, I'd like to echo the context. Great to hear perception as being foundation of some of the things you've talked about. I'm wondering if I can just indulge you a little bit. You've come with a perception of the coach on the athlete and didn't talk a lot about the athlete's perception. And I'm wondering if you can give a naive person, potentially a naive audience, a little bit more on what you might think with respect to the athlete's perception. Do they need to know more about talent ID to make themselves more accessible, more exposable? Is that a concept that you think will help the model that you've described?
Yes, definitely. I was in London about a month or so ago, and so again, I'm deviating from triathlon, but I will circle back to it. A number of professional football clubs in England have shut down their academies. And the reason they've done so is because the cost no longer justifies the benefit, because they've worked out that they've got about a 1% success rate, and it's costing them millions and millions of pounds every single year. And on top of that, there's a human cost, because a number of those young athletes are being brought into these academies at the age of 12, 13, 14, and being offered this single pathway. They're going to succeed, and then 99 in 100 of them don't, and there's no fallback plan. So I think to answer your question, I think that the most important thing is that there needs to be shared ownership of a person on that pathway. Now, the age at which you do that would be very important, because a 12, 13, 14-year-old doesn't deserve to have that burden placed upon them to actually own their own potential failure. Whereas the later you get, I think the more you have to start having that discussion. So I would say that the coach-athlete relationship, and it's not just coach-athlete, it's the whole system. You must constantly be aware as the athlete of where am I in this pathway. Be aware that there are multiple pathways for me. I mean, I was talking last night to Neil Henderson, where are you? Saying that your current #1 female athlete in the world actually took some time away and then circled back. So she did a detour and she got to the same point, as opposed to being constrained on this one pathway. So I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly the way that you intended it, but I believe that from the age of about 16, 17, coincident with where the athlete starts to specialize, that needs to be a very open conversation. It's like, where are we heading towards and how are we going to get there? And recognize that there has to be a lot of flexibility, and you have to own it yourself as the young athlete. You've got to own the actions that you take, and you progressively over time give that ownership over to the athlete as they get older and more capable of dealing with it. Yeah. Otherwise, as I say, you end up in a situation in England where they've basically just destroyed 99 in 100 teenagers by promising them something without any fallback plan. No, and there's a responsibility there. Like, you can't put an athlete in an academy and he just has to play football, because by the time he's 18, he's got very little schooling. He's got no options. You've sent him down a cul-de-sac and closed the gate on him once he's there. It's crazy.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Could you share with us your opinion about Youth Olympic Games in terms of development and knowing the age of these young athletes already racing at a very high level?
Yeah, if it was me, it's at the age of 16, I wouldn't back those games. And you know what the problem is if you could start at 16, I think it would be different. But you don't. Because the moment you have a 16 and under 16, because that is correct, please correct me if I'm making a fool of myself, but there's a 16 and an 18. Isn't there one for 16-year-olds as well? Yeah, so it's from 16. Because what that does is it creates a race to the bottom, because the moment that becomes the viable pathway, the ultimate goal is I want to be a senior Olympic champion. But I'm going to work out that to get there, I need to be here, I need to be here, I need to be here. And at some point there, I need to be at the Youth Olympic Games at the age of 16. And that means, like, by the age of 12 or 13, I need to have started specializing. So if this is the eventual goal, and this is where we want them to start, putting a highly competitive target at that point is only going to shift the start point even younger. And so I don't think that's wise. I think that there's probably a place for it, but I think it would be up to each individual nation, federation, sport, coach to try and manage that pathway. I would be very interested in the next decade or two to track what proportion of athletes successfully transition from youth Olympic medalist to senior, and I suspect that it'll actually be quite low. But a lot of people who compete at the Youth Olympic Games might then make it, because they'll be the later achievers, in the same way that I showed you the elites versus the near elites. So as a focus and as a target of itself, I worry that it's just driving that race down to the bottom even more, and would be more damaging than good.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.
Thank you, Ross.
you.